Hey guys, what's up? Welcome to this week's Q&A. As always, thank you so much for your questions. And also, as always, if I don't answer your question in this video, then go ahead and copy and paste it onto the bottom of this Patreon post, and I'll probably answer it in the next one. And also, don't forget to post any new questions that you have, as well as like all the questions that you want answered, because I generally answer the questions in order of how many likes they have. So let's jump right in. Fukai Mori asks, regarding language learning, what piece of advice that you've given in the past do you disagree with the most now? So probably this would have to be remembering the kanji. Back when I very first started YouTube, around 4 or 5 years or something ago now, I used to recommend that for people learning Japanese, the very first thing they do before they learn any grammar, vocabulary, or anything is go through the entirety of Remembering the Kanji books 1 and 3 by James Heisig, which means you're spending anywhere between 3 to 6 months doing nothing but just learning kanji out of context before you actually get into the meat of learning the language. And so that by the time you finish this, you can recognize and write out by hand 3,000 different characters, although you can't actually read any words or you don't actually understand anything of the actual language. So I think this is very bad advice just because it's extremely inefficient. It's much more efficient to use one of the newer methods. Like I realized that this was bad advice quite a while ago, mainly just because it seemed like the failure rate was just astronomical. It seemed like maybe 1 in 10 people who tried to do RTK first thing when learning Japanese would actually make it to the end, and 9 out of 10 people would quit somewhere else and somewhere along the way, and then end up not even learning Japanese. So that alone makes it a bad method. But then I realized that trying to learn kanji before you know the Japanese language just doesn't work very well. It leads to having a really bad retention rate. You forget all of it. And it's much better to just basically do the bare minimum of kanji up front, then actually get fluent in reading Japanese. And then once you're fluent in reading Japanese, then you can go back and gain a more in-depth knowledge of the characters if you want to, although doing so isn't really that important ultimately. And so it was through this line of thinking that I first came up with recognition RTK, which was a big improvement on the original remembering the kanji method. And then after that, I eventually came up with the JP1K method, which I still think to this day is the best way to tackle kanji as someone learning Japanese. So yeah, of course, there's a lot of things that I've updated my opinion on over the years, but this would probably be the thing that I disagree with the most compared to my past self. So Keisuke asks, what do you think people who learn a language relatively faster have in common? I personally think that people who speak eloquently in their first language, aka capable of constructing long and complicated sentences off the cuff with less grammatical mistakes, good at converting their thoughts and feelings into a language by choosing precise words and grammatical structures, etc., tend to learn a second language faster. I'm curious about your insight about the correlation between talent for language learning and other inborn talents. Yeah, so I do think that there is such thing as natural talent when it comes to language learning, but I don't think that that's actually the number one predictor of results when we're talking about actually getting good at a foreign language. I think personality factors actually play a much bigger role in determining what results someone's likely to have, because if you really get together all the people in the community who've gotten really good at a language really quickly, what they all have in common is that they all spent a shit ton of time on it and became pretty much obsessed with it and did nothing but immerse in the language for every second of free time that they had for 1, 2, 3, whatever years. So the type of personality type that's willing to just jump into it wholesale, really dedicate themselves, become obsessed with it, that's the type of person who's going to get good really fast. And that matters, in my opinion, more than any true natural talent. And also, so that's the biggest factor. I think maybe a secondary factor is people's ability to kind of be like Nike and just do it. The people who tend to be more analytically minded and they really like to try to understand everything analytically and they try to optimize the process, like they over optimize every little thing. They spend a bunch of time messing around with tools and the most optimal flashcard setups and all these different things, looking for the optimal immersion. A lot of times those people who kind of overthink the process, they also end up not getting good as fast because they don't actually spend enough time doing the real thing. It's actually the people who I've noticed are a little bit less analytical, a little bit more right-brained, who tend to just do the immersion. They put in the hours, they go with the flow, they tolerate the ambiguity, and they just figure it out along the way. Those tend to be the people who I've seen have the highest level of success. I think sometimes if you have a really strong analytical brain, that can actually hinder you a little bit, because so much of language learning isn't about understanding things intellectually. That's the job of a linguist, not a language learner. The job of a language learner is to just go with the flow and figure it out intuitively through mass exposure. And I've noticed that sometimes the more, I don't want to say artsy, but right brain type of people can be better at that. And so I think those are the biggest things. I do think that there is some correlation between native language ability and your ability to get good at a foreign language. I mean, if you can't even speak your first language well, it's kind of intuitive that chances are you're not going to end up becoming an amazingly eloquent speaker of a foreign language. But I don't know if this actually has to do with causation or just correlation. I mean, there could be some kind of causation here where the act of being good at your native language actually enables you to be a better language learner. And I'll talk about in a second why I think there is some evidence for that could be the case. Or it could just be that there actually is some inherent, natural talent for languages. And this talent for languages is responsible both for the result of being good at your native language and for the result of being good at a target language. So there's probably some aspect of both of this, but one interesting fact that I just remembered that makes me think maybe there is a more causal relationship between L1 ability, your native language ability, and your target language ability, is that I was recently learning about literacy rates in people who are born deaf. And it turns out that people who are born deaf have, on average, very low literacy rates. Like I think the average reading level of someone born deaf is like still at an elementary school or middle school level. It's very rare for someone who's born deaf to reach the level of reading ability of a normal hearing adult. But there are deaf people who do reach this normal reading ability, even though they're relatively rare. And what they have in common is that they're people who learned sign language from birth and are really strong at sign language. So a lot of deaf people, they're born to hearing parents, and so the hearing parents don't speak sign language. And so for the first year of that child's life, they don't get really very much language exposure at all because they can't hear, so they don't get exposure to spoken language, and then no one in their environment knows sign language, so they don't get exposure to sign language, and they basically have a slow start in all types of language. And these people, they tend to have a hard time getting to a high level at any language at all because they miss that first window of life where your brain is making this huge explosive growth in all areas, including language. But deaf children who are born deaf, but they're born to deaf parents, and so they get sign language input from the moment they're born, they go on to be really strong at sign language. And once they're strong at sign language, then when they learn how to read and write English, which is a completely different language than sign language. So learning how to read English for someone born deaf is like learning a foreign language, literally. When they eventually go on to learn how to read and write when they're a little bit older, they're able to be much more successful at this because they somehow kind of map on English onto sign language in their head. And so this was one interesting kind of fact that points to being really good at one language is important for being able to learn further languages, because at a certain level, if you're being good at one language means your brain is competent in mapping symbols and concepts at a very high, sophisticated level. And so if you don't have that skill, then of course you're not going to be a successful language learner. So maybe there's something to that. But overall, like I said, I think the number one predictor is your personality type. Do you have the personality type that's willing to just jump in and do it, be like Nike, and not overthink things and really commit to it? That personality type is probably going to have a much larger impact than are you truly more talented than someone else, So Steve Dibben asks, I'm in stage 3 and I'm beginning to utilize iTalki. Many iTalki teachers seem open to structuring a game plan based on what each student requests. What would you consider to be the most effective use of iTalki in a way that's complementary to Refold philosophy? What would you personally look for in a teacher? Would you request output corrections, pronunciation, phrasing, etc.? So yeah, I mean, it depends a little bit on exactly what you want to work on. I think if you go and read stage 3 of the Refold roadmap, we talk about practicing different aspects of output and then putting them together. So I don't think there's going to be, one simple like do X and with your teacher. But overall, I mean, I would think of it as output practice in a safe environment. So I would mostly want to just have conversations with the teacher, and I would be wanting to get feedback. So what I wouldn't want and this is probably pretty obvious, what I don't want is the teacher like giving me a curriculum and saying, okay, today we're going to be practicing talking about animals, and tomorrow we're going to talk about numbers. Obviously, we don't need that. So what we really just want is opportunities to practice outputting at our own pace, not really feeling rushed, not have to worry about shame or anything like that, or things being awkward. And so I would mostly, just want to have a conversation where the other person's going to be very patient and not give you too many of the answers. Like if you're thinking and you're struggling through something, for the most part, you want them to let you struggle through that and only really give you help, basically telling you a word or how to say something when you are kind of like, okay, I don't know, tell me. So they have to be patient in this sense and give you space. And then I definitely would want corrections, but how you should seek these corrections are going to depend on your level. So if you're at the point where getting corrected on every single little thing, including pronunciation, grammar, or whatever, would lead to you not being able to make it through a single sentence because you're just getting bombarded with corrections, then obviously that's not going to be helpful. So when you're still at that level, what you probably want is, rather than getting corrected in real time, you probably want to ask the teacher to kind of come up with a list of the mistakes that are the most noticeable and you make the most frequently. And at the end of every session, go through those mistakes. So this way, in the middle of the conversation, you're not getting stopped and corrected. So you can just focus on trying to get things out of your mouth, actually speak. And then at the end of the lesson, you can go over the biggest mistakes you made. And over time, as you make fewer and fewer mistakes, you eventually want to get to the point where they can just correct you in real time and just stop you and point things out, because you don't make enough mistakes for that to happen extremely frequently. So ideally, you would get corrected at the moment you make a mistake. I think that's what's actually makes it the easiest to correct that mistake. You want immediate feedback so that you can enter into a deliberate practice loop related to these things. But that's just going to be too stressful and not feasible if you're making mistakes left and right. So you have to at least get to the point where you're at a decent level before you can really move into that phase of getting real-time feedback for every little thing. So yeah, that would be my advice. Mostly you just want to have a conversation partner who's going to be patient with you, only help you out when you really need it, and then give you the right amount of feedback. So Anderson asks, is it a good idea to have monolingual definitions on the back of an Anki card, even if you don't 100% understand what the definitions mean? Yeah, I think that's definitely a good idea, because you're going to keep repping these cards, and eventually, in maybe 6 months from now, the card will come up and you will be good enough at the language to understand it. So then you can read it then, and that might lead to you having further insights or realizations about the nuance of the word, and that's going to be beneficial. Plus, even if you don't fully understand it, even partially understanding it can help you give you a clue as to what the word means, can give you extra exposure to the style of language used in definitions, and so it's going to be helpful in various different ways. So I would recommend having monolingual definitions, even if you can't fully understand them yet. What you maybe want to watch out for is sometimes you look up a word, and there's like 10 different definitions listed. Ideally, you don't want to just copy over all 10 different definitions and have this like gigantic wall of text on your cards. If you can, choose the one definition that's relevant and then put that on your card so that it's not totally overwhelming. And if you're not at the point yet where you can even determine which definition is relevant out of the 10 plus that are there, then maybe you can wait on the monolingual definitions. It's a little bit too early. When you're getting to the point where you're like starting to work with the monolingual dictionary a little bit, the definitions aren't totally incomprehensible. You understand big chunks of it, although other chunks are kind of not yet comprehensible. Then that's when it's going to be a good stage to put the relevant definition on your cards, even if you don't fully understand it yet. So Reed Manello asks, how should I best use my time? I have about 3 to 4 hours a day to devote towards studying Japanese. I'm halfway through the JP1K deck. Each day typically looks something like this: 1 hour active immersion, Japanese shows with Japanese audio and Japanese subs, pausing and reading each sentence and recognizing the words from my Anki deck. Then 1 to 1.5 hours of raw immersion, Japanese shows with just audio, no subtitles, no pausing/stopping, 45 minutes of Anki, and then 45 minutes of grammar. Anything I should adjust or modify? And I would say, no, that pretty much seems like a perfect language learning routine based on the amount of time you have. I really wouldn't adjust anything. You have your active immersion, part of it's intensive, part of it's free flow, got your Anki, got a little bit of grammar in there, and the ratios seem pretty good. So I would say, yeah, keep doing what you're doing. I think that is a pretty solid routine. So Christian Kapart asks, I really like using podcasts on Spotify to get pure listening practice. Got any favorites / suggestions? So I assume that this person means Japanese podcasts because, Japanese is the language that I'm fluent in and might actually be qualified to answer this question for. And so the deal with Japanese podcasts is that podcasts have really not taken off in Japan in the same way that they have in the West. Not at all. Japanese people are kind of old school and old style and a lot of different things, and this is one of them. So Japanese people still really like radio. Radio, it's kind of surprising, like even saying it in English now, I'm like, really? But it's like, yeah, Japanese people are still really into radio and listening to radio shows. So radio shows are much more popular than podcasts. And most Japanese celebrities, whether this is a popular voice actor or a normal actor or a comedian, most Japanese celebrities either have had their own radio show at some point or they have one right now. And so you can look on YouTube, you can search your favorite celebrity, and chances are there's going to be hundreds of radio show episodes recorded that you can listen to on YouTube. So in essence, a recorded radio show episode is no different than a podcast. They're generally about the same length, between 1 to 2 hours long. And if you were actually listening to a Japanese radio show on an actual radio in real time, then there would be music interspliced with conversation and the other segments that they have on the podcast. But if you're listening to a radio show recording on YouTube, then all the music segments are already cut out to avoid copyright and stuff like that. So what you're left with is basically just a Japanese podcast. So that is really your best shot in terms of podcast-like content in Japanese. I used to really like this show called Bakusho Mondai. Well, so Bakusho Mondai is the name of a comedy duo, and they had their own radio show. And in fact, I used to think that this was a podcast when I was first learning Japanese, because when I opened up the podcast app and I sorted it to Japan, it was always, it showed up there. It was one of the podcasts that showed up in the podcasting app, and it was always one of the highest ranked Japanese podcasts. And it was only later I realized that what it really is a radio show, and the recordings of the radio show would get uploaded as a podcast, basically. But I think now, due to copyright reasons or marketing decisions by the companies that manage these comedy duos, most of those are no longer on podcast hosts anymore. At least they're not on the ones that I've seen. And so if you want to listen to like Bakusho Mondai, it's probably not going to be on Spotify, I would guess. I haven't really checked, but most of these radio shows probably are not going to be on Spotify, and you'll probably have to go to YouTube, where random people are just probably technically illegally uploading it there. So yeah, that would be my recommendation. I don't really listen to a lot of, there's a couple Japanese podcasts I listen to here or there, none that I was really passionate about, and I think it would be worth recommending. So more than that, I would recommend, getting into Japanese radio. And I'll say the most popular kind of radio show or station, not sure exactly what it is, in Japan is called All Night Nippon. So All Night Nippon. And there's a bunch of different shows that are part of All Night Nippon. And it's extremely popular. Japanese people love it. And so listening to it is really great, not only for Japanese language, but for improving your understanding of pop culture as well. So Diller asks, would you say an ideal approach would be one like Ken's, that's all listening and learning the first 1,000 to 2,000 vocab, and after 6 months to a year, when your listening has surpassed your reading, then to start reading to speed up the process? It seems like a mix of both worlds approach, but it's just theory for me. So you can't really talk about an ideal approach in a vacuum, because what's going to be the ideal approach for you depends specifically on your goals. And what you have to take into account is what is your final goal, and how willing are you to take an approach that actually is more difficult and takes longer in order to get a better result. So basically, if your goal is to reach a high, strong level of fluency and to get there in a relatively short period of time with relatively little frustration, then the Refold roadmap is the ideal approach for you. If you want to reach the highest level possible and you're willing to put up with extra frustration and extra slow process, but you really just want to get to the highest possible native level in the long term, get a native accent, then you want to become, you want to learn entirely through listening until you're fluent in the spoken language, and then only learn how to read afterwards, just like a native would. So if you spend the first 6 months doing all learning through listening, and then after 6 months you start reading, that's somewhere in between these two approaches. So maybe that would be ideal if your goal is in between these two approaches. But everyone has a different goal and different priorities, and so you can't really talk about an ideal approach in a vacuum. So Daniel asks, I'm a little bit confused as to your approach to immersion. If I recall correctly, you said in a few videos that the best way to learn a language is spending hundreds, if not thousands of hours listening to and reading your target language. This is true. By this, do you literally mean that if I just listen to and read my target language and don't even bother to do things like look up words, study grammar, study SRS cards, etc., I will eventually learn my target language? Or do you think there is some other necessary component? So if you do nothing but immersion, nothing but reading and listening to your target language, you will certainly learn your target language and go on to be fluent. If you do things like study grammar and make SRS cards, then you'll get fluent even faster. So yeah, when you look within the big picture of learning a language, immersion, actually consuming content in your target language, that is basically the equivalent of diet and exercise if we're going to use the analogy of getting healthy. Things like studying grammar and doing the SRS cards, those are like supplements, but they're very powerful supplements. They're probably more powerful than supplements when you're talking about health. And so, yeah, they're not necessary, but they're very helpful, and they make the other things go smoother and go more quickly. So, yeah, no matter what your approach is, the main thing you're focused on should be getting hundreds and thousands of hours of exposure to your target language. If that's all you do, that will be enough eventually. But if you want to get there even quicker, then you can study grammar and you can use the SRS. So Orlando asks, is it bad that while I'm doing my Anki vocab and sentence cards, I look at and read it and then recall the meaning, and then when I listen to the audio on the card, I pronounce them out loud and do it as close to the native pronunciation and do it as close as the native pronounces it? I don't know if that's considered early output, trying to speak the words and sentences out loud for my Anki cards. Is it harmful even though I'm pretty sure I'm mimicking the words and sentences correctly? So when you're talking about reading sentences out loud, obviously that's not output in the sense of generating your own sentences and using grammar and vocabulary, because you're just reading a sentence that's already constructed. So we're really just talking about here, is it output in the sense of pronunciation? So it is output in the sense of pronunciation, but this isn't necessarily a bad thing. The important thing is whenever you're outputting the language early on, and you're actually pronouncing the language yourself, you want to make sure that you're getting feedback. So if you have a native recording and when you pronounce it yourself, you're imitating the native recording and you're very actively listening for any subtle discrepancies between your voice and the recording, then that's not really a bad thing, and it will probably help your pronunciation long term. But you have to be careful, because chances are, like 99.9% chance, is you're not perfectly imitating the audio yet. Because if you had the ability to hear audio and repeat it out yourself and say it with a truly and actually perfectly imitate the recording, then you're like 99% of the way to having a native accent, which chances are you don't, because almost nobody actually achieves that. So what that means is that when you're listening to the audio and then repeating it out loud, you're failing to reproduce it perfectly in some way. So your mindset should not be like, oh, to my ears, I perfectly replicated the sentence. Cool, let's move on. It should be, okay, to my ears, it sounded like I perfectly replicated it, but I know from my understanding of how language acquisition works that actually that's just the limit of my own perception at the moment, and actually there's some discrepancy between what I'm saying and what the recording is. I just can't hear what that discrepancy is yet. So let me listen really carefully and try to see if there is some sort of discrepancy between my voice and the recording. If you approach it from this mindset, then now you're turning the act of trying to mimic the audio into deliberate practice that's going to train your perception. And so if every time you do this, you're listening, you're saying out loud, and you're listening to it again, and you kind of have this like, okay, what did I miss this time? And over time, you're able to slowly find more and more things that you're off and adjust those things, then you're going to be slowly training your perception, training your pronunciation. But it's crucial that you have this mindset. If you just kind of say it out loud and like, yep, pretty much perfect, when chances are you're probably not, then that's when you're probably just going to ingrain bad pronunciation. So basically, the thing with making bad habits is that bad habits only form when you make the same mistake over and over and over. So as long as you're constantly improving and every time you say it, you get closer to the original, then you're not going to have the opportunity to make a bad habit because you're doing something different every time, right? By definition, habits are what form when you do the same thing over and over, and doing that thing becomes an unconscious behavior, right? So the key here is you got to make sure you're only outputting in a situation where you have feedback that allows you to constantly improve so that you're getting closer and closer to the original. If for example, you didn't have audio and you were just pronouncing it yourself, just based on what you think the language is supposed to sound like, then you're going to be off, and you're also not going to have any opportunity to get closer, and then you're just going to make the same mistakes over and over, and that's what probably would cause you some harm. So important nuance here is that it's fine to do what you're doing and could even be helpful as long as you're always looking for the discrepancies between your voice and the recording, and you're getting closer and closer to closing that gap each time. So Ivering asks, after finishing the JP1K deck, sorry, he forgot the K. After finishing the JP1K deck, what should I do? You should immerse yourself in the language, do intensive and free flow immersion, study grammar a little bit every day, maybe 15 minutes a day, and start sentence mining. And I also recommend checking out the Refold roadmap, where we tell you exactly what to do to learn a language. So Dylan asks, I find myself dreading doing Anki. I become frustrated because I often can't recall words that I feel I should know and that are super familiar. I sit there and redo the same cards over and over, and they won't stick. I've had difficulty with flashcards in the past, but I don't want to quit because I really want to memorize vocab. Any tips for memorizing? FYI, I haven't started sentence mining yet, and I'm halfway through the Refold 1K deck. So what I would do first is set a low leech threshold and get rid of leeches. So you're saying that you're failing the same cards over and over and over again, and this is not what you want to be doing. Basically, whenever you're learning anything, but especially when you're new to a language and you're trying to memorize vocabulary, you're going to have what are called leeches. And this is basically when, for whatever reason, something just doesn't stick. And it doesn't matter how many times you rep it over and over and over again, it's just like really slippery and you can't remember it. Once this happens, then you want to remove it from the deck, because trying to cram it into your brain through brute force is just going to be a waste of time. The mental image that I always have talking about leeches is like a screw that's become like de-threaded. So you know how sometimes if you take a screw in and out of something, or you screw it too far in one direction, then it gets to the point where it just spins around in place and it doesn't act like a screw anymore. It's like this threads just become totally loose and it doesn't actually have any hold. That's basically what's happening in your memory when something becomes a leech. So the first thing you want to do is set a low leech threshold in the Anki deck settings, which means that if you fail the card maybe 3 or 4 times, then it's going to suspend that card and remove it from your deck. So that's the first thing you want to do. And what you may find is that there's a relatively small number of cards, maybe between 10, 20, 30% of cards that were leeches, and the other 70, 80% of cards you were able to memorize just fine. If this is the case, then great. What you want to do is just get rid of those 20, 30% that weren't sticking, focus on the 70, 80% that are sticking, and get through the deck, and then start sentence mining. And once you get better in the language, then learning words itself will become easier, and then you can eventually go back and learn the ones that weren't sticking once your base level in the language gets better. Because once your base level in the language gets better, then you won't be struggling so much to learn those words anymore. But in order to pragmatically get you to that point where your base level improves, you got to let go of the leeches and stop worrying about them. So that's the first thing I would say. The second thing I would say is if what happens when you turn on the low leech threshold is that almost all your cards, like maybe let's say it's the reverse, right? Maybe only 10, 20, 30% of the cards stick, and like 70, 80% of the cards you just leech and you can't remember. This may be the case depending on who you are. Different people's brains work different ways when they're new to studying language. If this is the case, I would take a totally different strategy. And what I would do is continue to review the deck, but just stop failing cards. just mark every card good no matter what, and think of it as the cards are just exposure to the language. You're just exposing yourself. You're just telling your brain that these words exist, and you're not actually trying to memorize them. You're creating mental dictionary entries in your brain, which makes it more likely that you'll notice those words when you come across them in your immersion. So you might have to do this. This is totally fine. If so, then just take this approach of using Anki as just a way to get exposure to these words without trying to actually memorize them. And then focus mostly on immersion, and through immersion, and you'll still notice that you'll recognize a lot of the words that were in the deck, and then your base level will get better, and eventually you'll get to the point where remembering the words in Anki won't be so hard anymore. So I would really urge you to take this advice. Whatever you do, don't try to just brute force the words into your memory. That's the least effective and most frustrating strategy. So Sepia asks, I believe Stephen Krashen has said that people should use learner material until they are ready for native immersion content. Why doesn't stage one of the Refold guide recommend learner immersion content like comprehensible input channels on YouTube? The Refold guide does recommend that. And so, yeah, that's a great option. Although it's not necessary. If you find that kind of a comprehensible input that was created specifically for learners to be too boring or not engaging, then you can just jump into native content from day one and make it work. That's why I learned Japanese. Lots of people have done that. But it can be very effective to use learner materials like comprehensible input, and that is why we recommended it in the stage one section of the Refold guide. Casey asks, as a beginner, knowing almost no words, is it better to spend time rewatching anime even if I don't comprehend anything, or spend my time on the deck till I get a certain amount of words understood that immersion is easier to comprehend? You should do both. From day one, you should be doing immersion, and you should be memorizing words in Anki. So basically, a big part of acquiring a language, becoming able to understand spoken language, is allowing your ears to adjust to the language and acquiring the sound system through listening. No amount of memorizing words in Anki will do this for you. So even from day one, regardless of whether you know words or not, you're in an equally good position to start training your ears to hear the sounds of the language. And so you should definitely be spending time immersing yourself in the language from day one. But you also want to be learning words in Anki. That's the most efficient way to learn words and grow your vocabulary. So definitely want to be doing both of these things, which is why we recommend doing both of these things at Refold. So Joshua asks, what are some language learning techniques that you would be curious to try in the future? Learning a language entirely through listening without any study or looking anything up. So you literally just sit and watch TV shows in language and see how far you can get that way. That's something I want to try in the future. Trav asks, do you think somebody with a background in music, basically somebody with perfect pitch, or even just a strong, good sense of pitch, would be able to pick up on stuff like pitch accents or tonal aspects of languages more easily than someone who doesn't? Yeah, definitely. I think that if you have a really good ear for pitch, either because you were born that way or because you trained it up through music, then yeah, that will definitely help you a lot. I don't know if that means that just through immersion alone, you'll end up with perfect pitch, but you'll definitely have a leg up. It probably means that even if you didn't study pitch accent, you'll end up with better pitch than the average person who doesn't study pitch. And if you do study pitch, you'll have an easier time getting to perfect pitch. So it definitely will help you. And a similar line a similar idea is that what I've noticed is that Chinese people who learn Japanese as a second language generally are better at pitch. Most of them are not perfect at pitch, but they're better off the bat than most Westerners are. And some of the only people I've seen who are actually 100%, like literally native-like accuracy at pitch, are Chinese people who then studied pitch accent. So it kind of just goes to show you, it's like if you have a leg up, that means that you will be good, you will be better than most people even without studying. But to be perfect, you probably still need to study. But if you do study, it'll come more quickly to you than the average person. That's probably what's going to be the case. And also, Lamont wrote this in a response, but it's also something I had heard about before, that Chinese speakers, so people who grow up speaking a tonal language, are statistically way more likely to have perfect pitch than native speakers of other languages. So clearly there is some correlation here between pitch in the musical sense and pitch used in language, which is very interesting. So Krashen asks, how do you value words when deciding whether they are prime for mining? Even if a sentence is I+1, the word may be infrequently used and therefore not worth learning until much later. How do dictionary words fit into this when going through the monolingual transition? So it really depends where you are in the process. If you're very, very early on in the language learning process, then I would use some heuristic, like only mining words that you feel like you've come across multiple times in the past. So basically, if a word looks familiar to you, you have this sense of like, oh, I feel like I've seen this before. This looks familiar. Then you would mine it. But if a word doesn't fit that criteria, then you wouldn't mine it. But as you get better and better, then it's going to be rarer and rarer that you come across words like this, because you're already going to have learned all the most common words in the language. And then in that case, I would learn words based on just whether they interest you, whether you came across them in an interesting context, or whether your common sense tells you that it's a word worth knowing. I mean, sometimes you can't tell whether a word is rare or not just by looking at it, but a lot of times you can, right? Like if the word is the name of a specific type of bird or a specific type of flower, then kind of common sense tells you maybe, unless you're already at a high level of fluency, you shouldn't prioritize using this word. Whereas if there's a word like a verb, for example, most verbs tend to be valuable. Unless it's obviously some obscure verb that's used in some hyper-specific context. So a lot of times you can just let your common sense guide you and your own interest guide you. And even if every once in a while you end up learning a rare word, there's no harm done, right? Because in the long term, if you want to be really fluent, really comfortable in the language, you're going to want to know these rare words anyway. So if you're going to learn them all anyway, the order that you learn them, it's important, but it's only important up to a certain point, if you know what I mean. And a lot of times, if you come across a word that is relatively uncommon, but for whatever reason, the situation that you came across it in has a really big impact on your mind, you'll learn it so well that you'll notice it every single time it comes up, even though it's relatively rare. Like I actually remember when I first started AJAT, I was talking to some other Japanese learner who was also doing AJAT about this method, and I was like I had some random rare word that I had come across. The word was skoburu. And I was like, there's no way I'm going to like come across skoburu enough times in immersion to like really gain an intuitive sense of what it means, because it's obviously such a rare word. And the other guy's like, no, you will, trust me. And I didn't believe him. But because I had this little conversation with this guy, literally like to this day, every single time I come across the word skoburu, I like just a little bit in my head, I remember that conversation. And I was like, oh, there it is again. There it is again. And it comes up more often than you think. Like I thought it was like a rare literature word, which it is. But the other day, a Japanese person I was talking to used it in conversation. So, frequency is a kind of funny thing. Even if something is technically really rare on some official frequency list, that doesn't mean it's not going to come up. You never really know. So in a way, whenever you're learning a word, it's a little bit kind of like a gamble. Maybe it will be useful to you. Maybe it isn't. But it's okay to learn things that end up being not very useful to you if, on average, most of the things that you learn are useful to you. So you don't have to like get too anal about it is what I'm saying. You can kind of just trust your intuition, trust your common sense, and also you'll gain an experiential understanding over time, right? Like your sense of what's useful and what's not, that itself is a skill that will naturally get trained through the act of sentence mining, because you'll mine a bunch of words, you'll learn a bunch of cards, and then you'll go back out and keep immersing, and you'll see in your own experience which cards you mined ended up being useful and which ones weren't, and this will feed your intuition. So ultimately, these heuristics that I'm giving you should be enough to get you started, and then you kind of build your own intuitive sense of what's worth mining as you go along, and that continues to evolve as you get better and better at the language. So Diller asks, you said in an earlier Q&A that you should not start reading until you're at the point where you're happy with your pronunciation in the language. How do you get to this point? For a language like Arabic, where pronunciation is much more different than English, how can you get a perfect accent before starting to read? Well, so yeah, this was a more extreme argument that I made that was kind of in the context of a hypothetical. But yeah, hypothetically, if you were, this was basically, I think I gave this answer when I was talking about, if you were going to take an all listening approach because you wanted to do everything in your power to get a native like accent, at what point would it make sense to start reading? Because if you're taking this all listening approach solely for the purpose of your pronunciation, it's like, well, at what point has that completely served its purpose and now you can read and not need to worry about it? So under that context, the answer is, in that case, reading is going to basically have the effect of solidifying your pronunciation at whatever point it's at. Because when you read, you subvocalize in your head and you pronounce things in the same way over and over and over. And so if ideally you would only start reading once your pronunciation's already at wherever you want it to be. And then in that case, reading can't harm you in any way because it will only solidify your current state. And if you're happy with your current state, then that's no problem. But obviously this is not practical for the vast majority of people. Most people are going to be learning how to read and how to listen alongside each other. So they're going to be reading from the beginning. And that's totally fine. It doesn't mean that you're going to have a bad accent. You can still have a very, very good accent, because as you listen, you will still slowly update the model in your head. It may not be as likely that you go on to have a fully native accent. There might be some certain types of foreign artifacts and things in your speech. But for most people, that'll be totally fine because you can still have a really, really good, pleasant, comprehensible accent. But if, hypothetically, you wanted to take this really extreme approach of learning entirely through listening to give yourself the best chance of getting a native accent, how would you do it? Well, you would do it the same way you learned your native language, right? You would just learn through sound. And this doesn't mean you can't use any learner resources. Like you could actually use audio type systems like Pimsleur to learn about basic things about vocabulary and grammar. You could also go through an Anki deck that's audio only and gain knowledge of the language this way, get lots of immersion. And then you train your pronunciation through chorusing, shadowing, recording yourself and listening to it back and comparing it to a native recording. And just through trial and error, you figure out how to make these sounds, right? When you think about how you learned how to have a native accent in your own native language, no one told you what to do with your mouth and what to do with your tongue, right? Like, it's not like your mom was like, okay, time to learn the TH sound. So you're going to put your tongue like this, and then you're going to blow air out in a specific way. And it's going to be like, no one did that to you, right? Basically, you knew what it sounded like because you had perfect perception of the language, and then just through sheer trial and error, trying different things with your mouth and your tongue, you eventually stumbled upon the way to pronounce each sound perfectly. And in the case of your native language, that might have taken you a couple years, right? A lot of times 4 or 5 year olds in the language, they still have a funny accent. But as an adult who's acquired many different skills in your life and can practice more efficiently, you'll probably be able to actually go through this process much more quickly than an infant would. So in a lot of ways, adults have an advantage over infants because we're actually a lot smarter and can practice more efficiently. And so all you do is you train your perception through doing lots of listening and doing things like chorusing and maybe other acts like listening to the same recording of audio over and over and over again to really train your ear. And then once you can hear it properly, well, then just through trial and error and doing exercises like chorusing and shadowing, then you can hone your pronunciation over time and get it to the point where it sounds just like the original. And so really, pronunciation is, the way you phrase the question is kind of interesting. How can you get a perfect accent before starting to read? It's almost as if reading was going to help you get a perfect accent, but reading has nothing at all, anything to do with pronunciation. Pronunciation is something that entirely has to do with sound. You hear the language and you imitate what you're hearing. That's really all pronunciation is. And so learning how to read letters on a page has nothing to do with that whatsoever. So yeah, that's what you would do. Okay, so last question of today by Florian says, I am learning Japanese and focus on my writing ability. I write down all the sentences of the deck. In around 2 years, I am going to work in Japan and consider to invest more time into listening because I think I am not good enough so far. What could I get a lot of content for listening? Or where could I get a lot of content for listening? Where can you get a lot of content for listening? I mean, anywhere. Netflix, YouTube. I mean, those are probably your best bets, to be honest. You can get lots of dramas, TV shows, movies on Netflix, and there's literally lifetime's worth of content on YouTube. So if you wanted content for listening, that is what I'd recommend checking out. So that was all the questions for this week. I actually answered every question that has been asked at this point in time. I'm filming this Q&A a little bit early because I happen to have time today. But at this point in time, I've answered every single question again. So this was 2 weeks in a row. I've answered every single question, which means that if there's a question you want answered and you're on the fence between actually writing it or not, go ahead and write it, because it's very likely I will answer it. Because if things continue trending the way they have been, I will answer every single question next week. So that was all for this week's Q&A. Thank you so much for watching and supporting Refold, and I'll see you in the next one.